to another historical fiction author chat. And oh boy, I'm so excited because AJ Pearce is here. And she had this book, which I recommended to everybody out there a zillion times when it came out. But now her new book, Yours Cheerfully, is coming out. Hello, AJ.
Hello. Hi. How are you?
Very well, thank you. I'm excited. I did get to read your book. I did get to read an early e-copy of it, but I can't wait for everybody else to read it. And if they haven't, if you people watching have not read Dear Mrs. Bird, then you really should do that. You can read the book separately, but I'd rather not. Anyway, I'm very happy that AJ is here. We're going to do this thing. I'm going to read her bio and her synopsis, and then she's going to read the prologue to Yours Cheerfully to you. Ready? So sit back, get your biscuit and tea, because we are in the UK right now. And here we go. AJ Pearce was born in Hampshire, UK. Her favorite subjects at school were English and history, which are now finally making some sense to her. She majored in American history at the University of Sussex, spending her junior year at Northwestern University in Illinois, USA. She began writing as a hobby in 2005. In 2012, she came across a 1939 copy of a weekly women's magazine and had the idea of writing a novel set in wartime London. In 2016, following a 7-publisher auction in the UK, Dear Mrs. Bird was acquired by Picador and in the USA by Scribner after a similarly competitive auction. Dear Mrs. Bird was published in hardback in the UK in April 2018, becoming a Sunday Times top 10 bestseller 2 weeks later. It's been sold for translation in 13 other lucky countries. And now the synopsis for Yours Cheerfully. From the author of the jaunty, heartbreaking winner, that's from People, an international bestseller, Dear Mrs. Bird, a new, charming, and uplifting novel set in London during World War II about a plucky, aspiring journalist. That's such a great adjective. London, November 1941. Following the departure of the formidable Henrietta Bird from Women's Friend magazine, things are looking up for Emmeline Lake as she takes on the challenge of becoming a young wartime advice columnist. Her relationship with boyfriend Charles, now stationed back in the UK, is blossoming, while Emmy's best friend Bunty, still reeling from the very worst of the Blitz, is bravely looking to the future. Together, the friends are determined to make a go of it. When the Ministry of Information calls on Britain's women's magazines to help recruit desperately needed female workers to the war effort, Emmy is thrilled to be asked to step up and help. But when she and Bunty meet a young woman who shows them the very real challenges that women war workers face, Emmy must tackle a life-changing dilemma between doing her duty and standing by her friends. Every bit as funny, heartwarming, and touching as Dear Mrs. Bird, Yours Cheerfully is a celebration of friendship, a testament to the strength of women and the importance of lifting each other up, even in the most challenging times. And it's true, that book, it lived up to that and more. I love that book. So now I'm excited for you to read the prologue to everybody in your lovely voice, and I'm going to disappear so you can take over.
Thank you. Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, Genevieve. We're in the middle of a really rare heat wave over here in Britain. So I have the fans going. I'm under a glass roof. If I suddenly start melting, I do apologize. It's really, really hot and I'm not used to it. So yes, this is the prologue to Yours Cheerfully, and I think it's probably about 10 minutes. So I hope it doesn't bore you. I hope you stick with me on it and enjoy it. As Mr. Collins called a start to the Woman's Friend editorial meeting, to anyone watching, it was a perfectly normal Monday morning affair. Kathleen had handed out the agenda. Each member of staff had a folder full of their notes. And as usual, Mrs. Bustle had brought teas up to the 5th floor, despite the stairs playing havoc with her unpredictable leg. Might I ask, why are you all staring? Said Mr. Collins. He looked down at his waistcoat. Do I have something on my tie? I haven't seen a fried egg in weeks. The entire Woman's Friend team burst into applause. Congratulations, said Kathleen and I at the same time. Hurrah, cried Mr. Newton, as if Hitler had just taken a knock. Mr. Collins continued to look baffled. Hello, he said, as if he was struggling with a disappointing telephone connection. Mrs. Mahoney patted his arm fondly. Well done, she said. We're all ever so pleased. Lovely news, said Mr. Brand in his quiet voice. Mr. Collins looked none the wiser. About becoming our new editor? I prompted. Ah, that, he said, looking embarrassed. Well, yes, thank you, everyone. Bit of a turn-up. Didn't think it was my bag. Now, you're just being daft, said Mrs. Mahoney. With respect, she added quickly, remembering Mr. Collins' new, very senior role. None needed, he replied quite happily. Nothing will change. Mrs. Bird was hardly ever in the office, so you probably won't notice a difference. On the other hand, I hope perhaps some. He paused and gave me a look. It was only the third day of my probation, after all. So far, so good, he smiled. Plenty of time for a catastrophe, of course. Don't worry, Mr. Newton, I was only joking. Mr. Newton, our advertising manager, had gone pale. He was very good at his job, but did tend to look on the disastrous side of life. I felt myself blush. My first 6 months in magazine publishing had not gone entirely to plan, due to what my mother had called some unfortunate hiccups that couldn't be helped. It was very nice of her to put it that way, but not wholly true, as my father had remarked at the time. I don't wish to be unkind, Elizabeth, he'd said to her, but I think Mrs. Bird could be of the opinion that the unfortunate hiccup might actually be Emmy herself. He did have a point. Mrs. Henrietta Bird had been Woman's Friend's longest-serving agony aunt and acting editress, and as the new junior, part of my job had been to open readers' letters so that she could answer their problems. It had sounded straightforward enough, but I had struggled to come to terms with Mrs. Bird's approach to giving advice, which was slightly in the manner of Attila the Hun. It didn't matter that since the start of the war, many of our readers had been through the most dreadful time. Kindness was rather rarely her first port of call. It was fair to say that Mrs. Bird and I had not exactly got on. Mr. Collins, on the other hand, had been terrifically decent all round, and I was delighted he would now be in charge. Thank you for your kind words, he said. While I promised I will do my very best to give the editor job a good bash, I'm afraid we do have a slight problem now that Mrs. Bird has left us to join Livestock and Pet. The celebratory atmosphere disappeared in a flash. The threat of a blank page was unthinkable. But Mr. Collins was reassuringly calm. Clearly, he continued, we need a new Henrietta Helps. I realise it's urgent, but perhaps we should take the opportunity to try to find someone who doesn't actively terrify the readers. Everybody nodded their heads. I said absolutely, and Kathleen joined in with too right, and then Mr. Newton used the moment to say, there's a war on, in a grave voice, as if some of us hadn't yet cottoned on. I've looked at trying to take someone from one of the other magazines, said Mr. Collins, but frankly, we can't afford them. So I'd like to know who you think could do the job. Perhaps one of our existing contributors, Nurse Maclay, for example. Nurse Maclay was in charge of the Woman's Friend Mother and Baby Club, and took a similar approach to Mrs. Bird, only with a syringe. She's awfully busy with her baby advice, said Kathleen, and she puts the fear of God into the mothers, said Mrs. Mahoney less diplomatically. Kath nodded. That's true, she said. Nurse Maclay once told me that after the age of 5, people are either quite sensible or absolute idiots. If you haven't sorted them out by then, there's nothing more you can do about it, so you might just as well leave them by the side of a road. Good grief, said Mr. Collins. Perhaps Livestock and Pet could do with a nurse. Mrs. Croft is very nice, said Mr. Brand, of our cookery editor, although what's in the hot pot does take up her time. And her husband's not very well, said Kath, so she's struggling as it is. Well, we certainly don't want to add to that, said Mr. Collins. For someone who always said he understood books far better than people, he was secretly enormously sympathetic at heart. I'm sure we can find a new advice lady, said Mrs. Mahoney, who was in charge of production and known for her practical bent. It's not hard if you know what you're doing. A bit of guidance and some sympathy, and most people will cheer up. She looked around the table. You could do it yourself, Mr. Collins, except for the fact you're a man. Ah, said Mr. Collins, taking the blow in his stride. I do apologise, Mrs. Mahoney. It is a failing we must all try to bear. Mrs. Mahoney gave him an understanding look. It's not your fault, she said generously, and as if there was a possibility it could be. Women are just better at being helpful, that's all. Look at Hitler. No help to anyone outside of himself. I'd like to see him raise 4 daughters all on his own and make sure they're happily married to good sorts. That'd shut him up. Mr. Collins paused, tapped the end of his pen against his teeth, and then smiled at her. At first I thought it was because Mrs. Mahoney had come up with her own plan to stop the world's most obnoxious dictator, where so far all of Europe's leaders had failed, but it turned out it had given him an idea. As ever, Mrs. Mahoney, you are absolutely right. In fact, I don't know why I haven't thought of it myself. The answer is right under our noses. Mrs. Mahoney frowned. There you are, with 4 daughters, all excellent young women, all happy in their lives, having had the best possible support growing up. What finer qualification. Your advice would be better than anyone's. How about it? I can see it now. Mrs. Mahoney helps. Mrs. Mahoney looked horrified. But I'm production, she said. I don't write, I organise. I like organising. I don't like writing. Mr. Collins' face fell. Not even to help out, he said, looking sad. For all Mrs. Mahoney quite worshipping the ground Mr. Collins walked on, she was nobody's fool. An experienced and highly respected woman in her 50s. She was as sharp as a pin and knew a setup when she saw one. Not even if you open your eyes as wide as soup plates and butter me up like a good one, she said, as if he wasn't her boss, but a slightly errant son-in-law trying it on. I've an idea, said Kathleen. There you are, said Mrs. Mahoney before Kath could say what it was. What about Emmy? Said Kath. What if she did the writing? For Mrs. Mahoney, I mean, she added quickly, as everyone looked at her as if she was mad. After all, it was my fault Mrs. Bird had decided to leave in the first place. In her view, in light of the unfortunate hiccups, I really should have been sacked. But Kath was terrifically level-headed, and I could see she was being given the benefit of the doubt. Emmy could open the letters the way she always did for Mrs. Bird, then get Mrs. Mahoney's advice on each one and type it up, Kath continued, turning to the head of production, her eyes even bigger than Mr. Collins. Honestly, Mrs. Mahoney, you wouldn't have to write anything. Just tell Emmy what you'd advise and then check what she'd written to make sure you're happy. It would be smashing, kindly and cheerful, and just like getting a letter back from someone you really trust. A real change from before. We could call it Yours, Mrs. Mahoney. My friend had made it sound wonderfully simple. Everyone waited while Mrs. Mahoney considered things, and Kath adopted the most hopeful face imaginable. Turning her down would be like thumping a kitten. Mrs. Mahoney was not the thumping a kitten type. Well, she said, put like that, but I wouldn't want to have my name or picture in it. I shouldn't want that at all. Almost all magazines had a picture of their advice columnist. Mr. Collins leapt in. Of course not. Not if you don't want it. We can do a silhouette. Mrs. Mahoney looked doubtful and put her hand to her face. And we can call it something different, he said. Whatever you like. We could do it as a trial, and if you don't like it, we'll find someone else. Mr. Collins gave a devil-may-care shrug for added nonchalance, which nearly made me laugh. I could tell he was as keen as anything for her to take the job. I didn't say a word. I loved Kat's idea. Mrs. Mahoney was exactly the sort of person you would turn to if in a fix, and I desperately wanted to be part of the problem page again. I crossed my fingers tightly under the desk. I had seen more than enough letters from readers to know that just how much help was needed. Although the bombing had recently eased off and our readers were not spending quite so much time in air raid shelters, life was far from a breeze. In fact, for most people, it was still downright hard. If Mrs. Mahoney were to answer the readers' letters, Woman's Friend could really live up to its name. Mrs. Mahoney took a deep breath. Well, she said slowly, if you really think it could help. Enormously, said Mr. Collins, taking this as a firm yes. Enormously. Thank you very much, Mrs. Mahoney. You've made my day, and I should think everyone else's, including, if I can presume, Emmy's too. He threw me a quizzical look. How do you fancy working with Mrs. Mahoney on this? He said, all above board. He said it lightly, but I was very much aware it was a chance to prove myself, to show that after my more than wobbly start at Woman's Friend, I could really make a go of things. I'd mucked up with Henrietta Helps, but now I had a real chance to redeem myself. Yes, please, I said, and then turned to Mrs. Mahoney. If you're sure you don't mind. Mahoney gave me an encouraging smile, but raised a finger in warning. No silly business, she said, or making up answers all on your own. We shall work together as a team. Excellent, said Mr. Collins. Mrs. Mahoney, are you happy with everything? Mrs. Mahoney pursed her lips and thought. Yes, Mr. Collins, she said, I am. But it mustn't get in the way of my production work. What do you think, Mr. Brand? Our arts director, Mr. Brand, worked closely with Mrs. Mahoney, always more at home with pictures than words, Throughout the meeting, he had been quietly sketching, as usual in his own world. "I'm all for it, Mrs. Mahoney," he said gently. Then he repeated Kath's words, written kindly and cheerfully, like getting a letter from someone you trust, but not with your name, of course. He looked at his sketchbook and then held it up for us all to see. Just an initial idea, but perhaps something like this might look nice. It was the simplest illustration, just a few strokes of his pencil, showing an outline of a woman, clearly Mrs. Mahoney, sitting at a desk writing a letter. Mr. Brand had added a title for the page in a large friendly script. "Yours cheerfully. Woman's friend is here to help." Everyone looked at him and then to Mr. Collins. "It's perfect, Mr. Brand," he said, smiling. "As ever, you have summed it up to a T." The new editor looked at Mrs. Mahoney and me. "Here's to our new problem page," she declared, before Mrs. Mahoney could have second thoughts. "I'm very pleased indeed. In fact, we must celebrate. Could somebody go out and find us some buns?" He put his hand in his pocket and fished out half a crown. Now we all cheered. "Well done, everyone," said Mr. Collins over the noise. "Yours cheerfully it is."
Yay! I love that. I love Emmeline. And that was beautifully read. Is there an audiobook to go with it? I hope.
There is, yes. And it's read beautifully by Anne Popplewell, the actor. Best known for the Narnia films, I think.
Oh, wow.
And she does a wonderful job. She does Emmy and Bunty in particular, just beautifully. So, yeah, if you're into audiobooks, don't base it on me. Base your decision on a fantastic actor. And she does a lovely job.
Sounds like I'm going to have to buy that too. I already read the ebook, but I do love audiobooks. And I actually thought it'd be great in your voice, but people say that to me too. And I think, who really wants to listen to a 5-year-old's voice for the next, how many hours? So
I was kind of at 11 and overexcited that I've answered the phone all on my own. That was an 11-year-old when I was 11. Now 11-year-olds have their own phones and everything, don't they? I'm true. So old.
And they know how to work them way better than we ever will. I have no idea. I'm in the dark ages. My husband and I have one cell phone. We share it. So we have no idea where it is at any given point in time.
Oh, that's fantastic. I love that.
Yeah, nobody can ever find us. So Yours Cheerfully, and I love the title. And that's the thing about these two books. What I love is that it's historical fiction, and it's fantastic historical fiction where you're really delving into World War II, but into details that we don't know or don't think about. But you do it in such a way that, well, for me, I've never laughed out loud while reading a World War II book before. That just seems like something blasphemous, but it's something that's so needed. It's so uplifting to read it. How did you come to write in that tone? I know that you just started for fun in 2005. So Emmy kind of seems like you in a way. Just give it a go. Is that about right?
Yeah. The only thing Emmy and I have in common is we're both really bad at knitting. Really bad. I put that in as a slightly self-indulgent joke because I really am terrible and would have been useless in the war. But yes, Emmy she's very plucky and she's very optimistic. She's growing up in Mrs. Bird. I think she's quite naive about things. And one of the interesting things about writing a sequel is developing the character, particularly when the backdrop is a war, because they're going through things that thankfully we can only imagine. And anyone who's read Dear Mrs. Bird knows that there are lots of jolly bits in it, but there's some really tough stuff in it as well. And so it was very important writing Yours Cheerfully that I tried to take that on and not have all the characters suddenly bounce back and be terrifically happy again. But equally, nobody wants to read a book which is everyone sitting around going, crikey, wasn't everything horrible in the last book? So it is a fairly jolly book. They both are, really. And I know that does seem odd, and I see that a fair amount of readers say, there aren't many books set in World War II which are funny. And I think the reason it has that sort of tone is that it's part of normal life. I think it's quite a British thing as well, that we have quite the worse things get, the more we kind of try to laugh at them in an appropriate fashion. And certainly during the war, morale and trying to continue to have the sort of life that you used to was super, super important. And people still fell in love and still got married and fell out with each other and lived and loved and did all the things that people always do. And they also went out to parties and to nightclubs and to the cinema and to the theatre. And they tried to close the theatres and cinemas down when, in fact, they did close them at the start of the war. And very quickly they realised it was really bad for morale. So as far as they possibly could, some form of social life did carry on because it kept people going, really. So that's why there's all that sort of thing in the books of people. I always say they're books about ordinary people in extraordinary times. So they're just like you and I. They're just trying to make the most of things and be happy.
And I love that. And the way you do that, I mean, we have to remember once in a while that war was 6 years long. And as you say, people had to have lives. Most historical fiction zooms in on a specific time, a specific event that we don't know about, that we want to learn about, and it's all that. But really, if you back up from it with a larger lens, these people were just living. And that's what Emmy does, and Bunty and Charles, and they're just really, they're delightful to read about. So I would love to be able to write that way. I read something, and I know that you won't mind because we talked about this a little while ago, but I read something on Instagram that you answered that somebody said, and I relate to this because I've read the same thing about my books, that your books are easy to read, and that must be easy to write because of the tone of it, because they're so accessible. That must be easy. Do you find there's any, I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me because we work just as hard on the research and the writing, but it does come off as easy. How did you answer that? I remember you did that, but I can't remember it.
Well, firstly, thank you. That's the idea, is that people, I think when you read a book, the last thing you want to do is to think, crikey, that poor old author's been gnashing her teeth over this chapter, because I think that means you've not really succeeded. Unless it's an autobiography, then of course it makes sense. But in fiction of any genre, I just want to immerse myself in that world and that character and that story. I don't really want to think about what the author was doing, because then it breaks that bubble a bit, like in the theatre. You don't want to be aware that you're sitting next to a bunch of people and somebody's eating some Maltesers. You're there in the moment. So I find writing really hard, actually. I don't find it particularly. Some days, it's like you have this golden moment where you're typing away and you just kind of go, oh, I love this. And then the other 99% of the time, no, it's not that bad. But there is an awful lot of crafting, I suppose. It's crafting it and being in the moment and being with those characters, but also going back in the edits and trying to make the rhythm of the writing better, or the points you're making softer. But I do love being writing when it does come easy. I find dialogue very easy, actually, to write.
Yes.
I have to be quite careful. I bang on for ages with characters just chatting away to each other and then forget we're supposed to have a plot. But I think, yes, sometimes I know if it's going well, actually. If I'm typing away and I go, oh, wow, oh, go on, oh, gosh, I hope he likes her, about something I know, AJ, you know he does, it's in your plan. But you sort of forget yourself, or if you're in the first book, not to have a spoiler, but there's a scene where awful things happen, and the chapter before then I knew what was going to happen, but the characters obviously didn't know. And I remember as I wrote it, the first draft, I had tears rolling down my cheeks because in the happiest of scenes, because I knew what was going to happen, and I felt so horrible that here I was writing this character that was having a lovely time and was full of joy, and I felt really mean that I was just about to change things quite dramatically. So it's a funny old business writing, isn't it?
It's
very old.
It is, and I know exactly the thing. I've cried so much writing books, researching, writing, and then editing, and then reading. But with yours, it's nice to have the laughter in there too to counter it. But both of them were beautifully done. So you talk about the plan. So that begs the question: are you a planner? Are you a pantser or a plotter? Do you know all this research ahead of time, or do you build it in as you go?
Well, I do plan. I write a sort of a chapter outline to start with. Once I've kind of been sticking the story together, I write and got the okay from my editors that they quite like the idea, and then I sit down and write about a 10,000 word outline of it, and that's my sat nav. I always call it my sat nav because I know and it'll change. But it is a little bit like leaving a major town and driving off, and I might want to get to Edinburgh. But if I know the route, I wander off and look at some pretty things on the way, I can always come back onto that main route. Whereas if I don't have any idea how to get there, for me at least, but I could end up in Berlin, and that's not because I don't know what I'm doing. So and I do love sitting down with a new chapter, going, okay, in this chapter, she has to get on a train, and by the end of the journey, this has happened. And then I can not worry about the plot, but just have fun with what happens. So, yes, I like planning, but it isn't. It's a plan, not a law. It's kind of, if I decide it's not good enough or it needs to change, then obviously it will.
Yeah, and do you do the research ahead of time or as you go?
A bit of both. It's my favorite bit, so I have to I don't know if you do this, but you can go down those rabbit holes of interesting things, and then you realize you haven't written any words for 9 hours. Either
that, or you've written way too many words that aren't going to be needed in the book at all, but it's still interesting stuff. I've done that many times for sure. I'm very envious. I would love to be a planner. I've tried doing the chapter thing too, but then I get to like chapter 5 and I think, oh yeah, but now I think I'll go back and write it. And I have no idea what happens after chapter 5. And I do try. And my editor, I think, would love it if I could actually do that. Maybe next book. I don't know.
I think that's really, really clever. I just don't have the ability to just sit down and bloom, just go off down a yellow brick road to an exciting thing. I can't do that. So yes, I come to the conclusion that I clearly am not a very spontaneous person.
Well, I'm not either. That's why it's such a struggle. I think it would make things a little bit easier for me if I could do that. So I will try that. So now August 10th is release day here in Canada. And everybody out there, really, you can pre-order it or you can buy it on launch day or whatever, but you have to do it. And dear Mrs. Bird. So every time I come out with a new book, about 2 days after, everyone picks it up and then they read it and then they say, so now what? What's next? So I'm going to ask you that question. Are you writing something now? Or are you going to wait a little bit, give yourself a bit of a break and then be going on?
Yeah. Well, I've had a bit of a break, I think, because I finished the edits earlier in the year. And now I'm working on the next one in the series. So so it's that lovely time when the pressure is off a little bit and I can go and read my hundreds of magazines from the war and all the reference books and go and speak to people. Next week I'm going to go and have a chat with a lady I'm being introduced to who is 104. Oh. And so we'll have so that's perfect because that's pretty much the same age as Emmy and Bunty would be now. Yeah. And so I'm really excited about that. And I love getting the opportunity to chat to people and ask them about their experiences because there's there is no better research, I think. It's just you get someone's unique personal memories, and when they're generous enough to share them with you, it's both exciting and really lovely and unbelievably helpful as well. So I'm at that stage where everything is a possibility for the book, and no, I haven't had any editors reminding me it has to have a plot. It has to happen. Because if it was up to me, I would just have the characters who I love. I would just the guys I was reading from the book earlier, I'd just send them on day trips to the beach and stuff, and stick them all on a bus and let them have a jolly time together. If it was up to me, I just really love
lots of dialogue, just talking and talking.
Yeah, and nothing would happen. But occasionally, I'll read something. Someone will say, "This is not a book with twists in it," and they're absolutely right. I mean, hopefully, it's not predictable. And this the plot in Yours Cheerfully, I'm really proud of. It's a story that means a lot to me. But it isn't the sort of book like a thriller where at the end you go, "Oh my word, tan tan tan." But nevertheless, getting the plot right and weaving it through with everything that's going on, and obviously the real events of the war, is a challenge that I always really enjoy. I love the sort of the build up, and then how bad can you make it for various people? What hurdles can you put in their way? I love that part about writing.
Yeah, and that's where all the twists have to come in. That's the hardest part for me. I can visualize all of their lives and adventures, but then to put a twist in the end, I'm not a suspense thriller writer. I don't know how that works, but
I don't know how they do it. And also to spend months and months on really dark themes and sad stuff.
Yeah.
When I have to write sad stuff, I find it really upsets me. I will write more and more and more in the chapter before something awful is about to happen. Of course, it all gets edited out, but people are going off chatting with other people unnecessarily before they get to the scene where something happens that isn't very nice. I'm not very professional, am I?
I love that. That's getting.
I don't want them to be happy.
Yeah. That's the best, though. I've got all the tragic storylines in mind, and I feel the same way. Let's just have a laugh. Let's just have a good time. But that's hard to do sometimes when you're in that dark place. So, well, I love these books. I'm excited for book number 3, and I hope that I'll still be doing these chats then, so you can come and chat with me again.
Oh, that'd be nice.
That would be fun. And maybe we won't be in a heat wave, and we can all be more comfortable at the time, and we'll see. Thank you so much for being here with me and for chatting with us and talking about sweet little Emmeline and everybody else in Yours Cheerfully. And it's great to see you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's so nice to speak to you. And maybe one day I'll get to come over and we can actually meet up and chat to everyone in real life. That's the dream.
And we'll have a happy dialogue. We don't have to have any tragedy at all, just happy. It's perfect.
Keep the tragedies in the books.
That's great. Exactly. Thank you again, and I will see you around.
Lovely. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Okay.